Sometimes the subject is drunk. We've had our share of stoned subjects come into the lab. So you still need to be able to exclude subjects, but you can't exclude people just because you don't like their results.
Charge up your axons, ready your receptors, and shift your lobes into upper beta phase. You are listening to Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast dedicated to helping you optimize your brain with the latest breakthroughs in neuroscience, nootropics, and psychopharmacology. Hello and welcome to Smart Drug Smarts. My name is Jesse Lawler. I am your host, and this is the 186th episode of this podcast dedicated to anything and everything that you can do to help the workings of your brain, which oftentimes involves determining what you can believe, what is good science, and in situations where there might be alternate facts, and yes, I use that term in air quotes, determining which of those facts are most plausible. So this is going to be sort of a meta episode about the state of science in general, rather than any particular compound or a type of cognitive intervention or strategy. We're going to be talking about sort of a hot button issue in science the last couple of years, what is being called the replication crisis, the disturbing finding that a lot of scientific results do not seem to be replicable when second or third groups of researchers try to perform the same experiments. Calling into question, of course, was the original finding actually a finding? This is something that has a lot of hackles raised both within the scientific community and in the public at large. Being able to know what you can believe is obviously very, very important to everybody, and the idea that scientific proof might be losing its legitimacy because of some bad scientific apples or sort of the standardization of some bad practices is a really big problem, and luckily one that people are working to address. We're going to be speaking with one of the primary voices in this ongoing conversation, Dr. Rolf Zwaan, in the main interview. We will keep it slightly related to playing well with others in the ruthless listener retention gimmick and show you how smiling during success can work against you. But for right now, let's kick things off as usual with This Week in Neuroscience. Smart Drug Smarts, This Week in Neuroscience. So sometimes a finding in neuroscience can really take away your sense of agency, that you control what you are going to do in any given moment, or at least that it's your thought processes and sort of these higher level experiential things like emotions that are turning the dials of our behavior rather than things at a really, really chemical level. And that can be weird to think about and something that I think we oftentimes try to put out of our heads, but sometimes a finding really kind of smacks you with the obviousness of a conclusion like that biochemistry rather than anything that we would consider personality or rational decision-making or even irrational decision-making is at the core of what we do, especially if you are a rat. This is a rat-based study that I'm about to talk about, but it deals with amygdalas and oxytocin, both of which are represented in human brains and all other mammal brains, I think. Oxytocin we've talked about before. We even had an oxytocin episode a while back. It is known colloquially sometimes as the love drug. Has effects on everything from mother-child bonding to pair bonds and couples to how frequently we urinate. One other specific thing that we do know about oxytocin is that it's known to inhibit a basic self-defense mechanism that animals have called freezing, which is exactly what it sounds like when danger enters the scene and an animal freezes up. This might be a deer in the headlights or a cat comes into the room and you happen to be a mouse. The first thing that you're inclined to do is to freeze up, not move, and hope that the danger passes. But if you've just gotten a squirt of oxytocin into your amygdala, you no longer do this. This has been known for a while, but it hasn't been clear quite why this is the case, why this is an adaptive strategy for the brain to behave this way. But a new study conducted at the Chimpalamod Center for the Unknown in Lisbon, Portugal, they seem to have connected the dots here between oxytocin's role in mother-child bonding and its ability when in the amygdala to keep an animal from freezing up when experiencing fear. Researcher Marta Moita led the study, and she says, "We developed a new experiment that allows us to study the mother's defensive behavior either in the presence or the absence of her pups, while at the same time testing whether oxytocin's action in the amygdala is required for the regulation of this behavior." So in this experiment, the rat moms were taught to associate a peppermint smell with an oncoming electric shock. If they smelled this smell and their pups weren't around, they would freeze up. But if the pups were around, they would try to protect their offspring from the peppermint by attacking the tube that the smell was coming from, or by pulling up bits of material from the nest, trying to wedge them in the tube, keep the smell away. Or if the pups were a little bit older, they would nurse and groom the pups, generally keep them in close contact, mothering them. However, when the scientists chemically blocked the activity of oxytocin in the mother rats' amygdalas, they went back to freezing when the peppermint smell came. They basically ignored the pups, turned into crappy moms, every rat for itself kind of thing. Another really interesting and unexpected finding of this experiment was that the rat moms who had their maternal instincts kind of neutered by the scientists, those pups themselves did not learn to recognize the peppermint odor as a threat. When the pups were later placed by themselves in a box and exposed to the peppermint, they didn't freeze. So it's like they didn't learn that this was a threat smell, whereas the pups whose moms had reacted the appropriate way, trying to protect the pups or at least cuddle them and soothe them, they did freeze up as they should when exposed to the peppermint smell alone later. The researchers speculate that a pheromone emitted by the caring mother might be at root in this type of learning in the older pups. That they don't know about yet. It's speculation at this point, but as Moita says, in all likelihood, similar mechanisms may be at play in us humans.
Smart Drug Smarts, the podcast so smart, we have smart in our title twice.
Picked up a couple of 5-star reviews on iTunes. Listener Traveler12345 from Australia says, I can't recommend this highly enough. The show retains integrity despite being a commercial offshoot of a supplement company. The production quality is the best I've heard and the information quality is astounding. Technically, the supplement company is an offshoot of the podcast and not the other way around, but I digress. And listener Vujay715 from the USA says, this podcast is never afraid to cover emerging sciences and it's helping to push great information to the forefront. It covers such a broad range of topics that it keeps me coming back for more. Well, thank you both very much. Thank you to everyone that's been leaving iTunes reviews. Also, big thanks to anybody that's been dropping the word on Smart Drug Smarts through less algorithmic means, graffiti, billboard, forwarded emails, whatever it is you might be doing. And it really does help create a nice little water wheel of information where new people find out about the podcast, request new topics, or point me in directions that I might not look otherwise. So a big thanks to everybody spreading the word. I'd been teasing at it for a while, but it's finally happened now. We launched the new smartdrugsmarts.com website a few days ago. Still doing a little nipping and tucking here and there, but it's looking quite good. I'm very pleased with it. A big hat tip to Smart Drug Smarts listener Alexa, who has come out from the woodwork and has been hugely helpful over the past couple of weeks in getting stuff ready. If you have not been to smartdrugsmarts.com recently and you pay a visit, you'll definitely see some changes. And you can still always get to any of our past episodes if you know the episode number just by typing that in following smartdrugsmarts.com. For example, this episode will be smartdrugsmarts.com/186. We've also got our not to be missed newsletter, The Brain Breakfast, which you pretty much can't miss if you make it to the site. You can sign up for that in the footer of any page on the site or any number of other places. We've also got a shop link, which will shoot you over to the aforementioned supplement company, Axon Labs. You can also key over there directly by going to axonlabs.io. Got a couple of supplement stacks over there, Nexus and Mitogen, which debuted just about 2 years ago. We're actually coming up on the 2-year-old birthday for Axon Labs. We'll probably do something birthday-rific and special when that happens. Of course, you could always prepare for that by going to Axon Labs and stocking up on Nexus or Mitogen. Never hurts to have some cognitive enhancement handy when you're not sure what the future holds. Cognitive stimulation from the CDP choline, antioxidation with pycnogenol, neuroprotection, and enhanced short-term memory with aniracetam. That being said, I'm actually going to be cutting Nexus, Mitogen, and everything else out of my system very soon here. Getting ready in a little less than 3 weeks to do Waterfast Week 2017. Going to be going for a whole week on nothing but water. We'll be talking about that more in a future episode, but if you want kind of a heads up and you're interested in perhaps participating yourself, I would direct your attention to smartdrugsmarts.com/waterfast. We'll be having a group of people doing it online together, mutual support and commiseration, and virtual tummy rumbles happening in just about 2 or 3 weeks here. But that's all for now, so let's move on to the main interview.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So a little bit of background before we get into this interview. One name that you're going to hear dropped fairly early in this is Diederik Stapel. And this guy is a recent villain in the history of science. He's a former Dutch professor of social psychology at Tilburg University, and before that, the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. In September 2010, he actually became the Dean of Social and Behavioral Sciences faculty, and less than a year later, he was unceremoniously suspended in the midst of an investigation into data fraud that he'd been conducting over a number of years, a number of papers, at least 55 publications where he'd manufactured data. This understandably caused a big kerfluffle in the scientific community, leading to questions not just about this one bad apple with a lack of personal integrity, but also how the scientific system allowed him to get away with this for so long before he was caught. Pretty much the root goal of science is to try to approach truth, try to at least hone in towards something that's verifiable and accurate and replicable. If somebody's making up fake data, then chances are that their work could not be replicated. And of course, there's plenty of instances where honest mistakes could also lead to non-replicable data, but obviously there's a problem with the scientific system if that kind of thing can slip through the cracks. So this all leads to the replication crisis, as it's now being called, which has become something of a turf war in the scientific community, trying to establish just how science should be conducted, how experiments should be run, what publications should and shouldn't be publishing, how the playing field of science can be organized so people aren't incentivized to rush out data that they might not have had time to fully fact check and verify, and at the same time that proper credit for discoveries goes to the discoverers. So a big swirl of politics and policy, generational divides between older scientists and newer scientists. You've really got all the elements of a Shakespearean drama here within the scientific world. And guiding us through these waters in the coming interview is Dr. Rolf Zwaan. He is a professor of biological and cognitive psychology at the Erasmus University Rotterdam, and he's become one of the leading voices advocating reform for science to police itself and make sure that data is replicable and is essentially real data that can be put out to the public and people can rely on. So with all that as preamble, here we go talking about the scientific replication crisis with Dr. Rolf Zwaan.
We set out to investigate this potential fraud case. It turned out to be revolving around a person named Dirk Smeesters, who was from Belgium. He published a lot in the area of social psychology, which has a lot of overlap with marketing. And some questions had been raised about his results, which had been deemed too good to be true. And so one of the things we had to do was try to find his data and see if there were patterns there that indeed, were problematic. When we looked at his data, we saw that he often collected much more than he reported. So, for example, in one of his studies, he was interested to see whether the complexity of a design influenced how much people would pay for an item. And so one of his items was a T-shirt, and he had a T-shirt with a complex design on it and one with a simple design. And he found that people, if they were conservative, they paid more for the simple design, and if they were liberal, more for the complex, something like that. But he also had a lamp and a rug and one other item in his set, but he never reported those.
It only held true with T-shirts.
Right. So he basically cherry-picked, and there were lots of other issues. And as he said, this is not just me, lots of other people in my field. And of course, Stapel was also in that area of social psychology. So that made it much clearer to me than it had been before that there was a real problem, that the field had a problem. Here we were just looking at social psychology, but maybe the problem was broader. One of the things you wonder about then is, if somebody else tries to replicate that study by Smeesters with the T-shirt, he's very likely not to find anything because Smeesters didn't just have the T-shirt, he had 4 or so other items, and he just picked the one that was best for his hypothesis.
Sort of try to clarify this for people a bit. If you're looking for a needle in a haystack and you make the haystack large enough, then sort of random chance at some point is going to dictate that there's a needle in there somewhere. And you select it after the fact.
Yeah, exactly. It's more like you actually had 500 needles in the haystack, but you reported that you found one. And so it made me think about fraud, but it also made me think about some of the procedures that people may normally use, excluding data that don't look too good for the hypothesis. Maybe not because they're committing fraud or they're doing it consciously, but because they're thinking, this was not a good item after all. I shouldn't have included it. I think a lot of that is just normal thinking, or was normal thinking among researchers. And based on this discussion, a whole debate erupted on replicability. There was a project headed by Brian Nosek of the Center for Open Science, and it led to an article that was published in Science last year. In that project, they investigated 100 studies from the areas of cognitive and social psychology that were published in 3 journals in 2008, I believe. So they had 100 studies and they tried to replicate them. And they found that only a third of the social psychology experiments replicated according to some criterion, and about half of the cognitive experiments. So even though cognitive psychology was less problematic than social psychology, it still was problematic. And so that made me think, what results are actually replicable? What should we do when we design a new experiment based on somebody else's research? Should we do our new experiment or first try to replicate the original experiment, see if we can get the effect, and then move on from there? And this is something that Richard Feynman had pointed out in the 70s, where he said psychologists don't replicate, they start doing new experiments without first seeing if they can reproduce the finding in their own lab. And he found that very strange coming from physics. So nothing had changed basically in 40 years. It was still the case that there was very little replication in psychology. But now I started doing this and a lot of other people, and it was just very disappointing to find that so few findings replicate.
When you're putting together a experiment that is essentially a clone of a study that's already been done, is that as difficult logistically, financially, all those other things as it is to do it the first time? Or is there diminishing expense or difficulty to replicate an experiment that has been done previously in another lab?
That's a good question. I think it depends a little bit on the nature of the original experiment. A lot of the experiments in the field of cognitive psychology are computer-based. So in order to replicate it, you can ask the original researcher, can I get the program that you used to collect the data and tell me a little bit about the setup, and then you can run their program and you're fine. A lot of the social psychology experiments involve interaction with subjects, or they involve subjects picking cookies from a jar or something like that. So they rely far more on environmental factors and on the interaction with the experimenter. So they are maybe a little bit more sensitive to replicability issues, but on the other hand, they're very simple to execute. So I wouldn't say that those experiments are necessarily logistically more involved than the original experiments. You need to contact the original researcher, get a little bit of information about their setup, but it's really not undoable. Now, if we move to neuroscience, there it might be more difficult, especially if you have special population, let's say a population of autistic children or a certain group of patients with certain characteristics, then it may be more difficult to replicate such a study. It may be more difficult to recruit the subjects. And of course, such experiments are also expensive. So it's much harder to replicate a study in neuroscience than it is in social psychology, because that involves practically no technology, which may also be why social psychology has often been the target of replication efforts.
I'm going to ask a question. This is going to be hard to give a straight answer to because I'm sure a lot of these findings would never be published anywhere. But for the average research experiment that's conducted, how many of them have significant findings versus those that, hey, nothing seems to be going on here, and that the variables that are being examined really don't seem to have an effect on the outcomes?
Yeah, that's hard to put a number on. I wouldn't say that the published experiments, which are usually the significant ones, are the tip of the iceberg, let's say 10%. It's probably more than that. I'm guessing the number of experiments that don't yield significant results may be around 60%.
Yeah.
But this could be for many reasons. Could be because really there's no effect there, but could also be because the experimenter screwed up in some way. So some experiments are just failures because of a mistake. But if an experiment was designed properly and carried out well, and you don't find anything, then it's not a failure. It basically is an experiment that failed to show an effect, but the experiment itself is not a failure. So those experiments should be published, but they are not typically. So it's not just the researcher who thinks, well, okay, I'm not going to write this experiment up because it's not significant and it won't get published. They've internalized this behavior because they know that when they do submit, the editor will tell them, well, this finding is not significant or the results are not very clear, so I don't consider this much of an advance, so I'm going to reject your paper.
Right. Nobody ever got a Nobel Prize for validating a null hypothesis.
Yeah, exactly. Something like that. So that's why there's a whole movement now spearheaded by Chris Chambers. In England, he's an advocate of pre-registration, where you as a researcher pre-register your experiment. You provide all the details about how many subjects you're going to run, what procedures you're going to use, how you're going to analyze the data, and what your hypotheses are, and so on. And then that proposal gets reviewed, and if it's accepted by the journal, your manuscript will be published after data collection, of course. What that means is that the research is being evaluated based on the design of the study and the interestingness of the question and so on, and not based on the results. Because otherwise you could have something that's kind of flaky, but it looks interesting, and lo and behold, there's a significant effect, so the study gets published.
Right now, I guess double-blind and placebo control are kind of the two things that represent gold standard scientific study. Would this be saying that the new gold standard would be double-blind, placebo control, and pre-registration?
I think so, yeah. We do it now for all our studies that I do with my collaborators. We design the experiment and determine the sample size and so on, and then put a pre-registration on the Open Science framework, and then we collect the data. So that means that we have in writing what we said we would do, do before we did it. What happens in other cases is that people will say, okay, yeah, I plan to run 60 subjects, but look, the effect is already significant with 40, so I'll stop. I'll call it a win, and that's actually not appropriate. You'll also see that people do the opposite and say, okay, well, I don't have a significant result yet, and I've run 60 subjects. I'll just continue until I have 100 subjects.
Right.
So those things happen, and with pre-registration, you avoid it because you say ahead of time, I'm going to run 100 subjects, and you may still have exclusions. So, there may be sometimes a subject is drunk or something like that. We've had our share of stoned subjects come into the lab. So, of course, you still need to be able to exclude subjects, but you can't exclude people just because you don't like their results. Pre-registration turns people into honest researchers and makes the reviewers and the editors consider the actual merits of the research, which are in the question, the design, the sampling plan, and so on, and not in the result, because the result is the only thing that the researcher has not under control, ideally, at least.
So I feel like most people, if you don't really have a dog in this fight and have a study that might not be replicated, you're going to be on the side of the people that want to reform the way that this is done and have regular replication kind of cooked into the system. For the people that are pushing back against this and standing up for the status quo, what intellectual leg are they standing on? What exactly is their position?
Well, they will say, for example, about pre-registration, they'll say, oh, research is creative. By enforcing pre-registration, you're cutting off our creative wings. And the response to that is, no, you can still also be creative and come up with all sorts of exploratory analyses after you've looked at the data, but you just need to be able to separate the pattern that you predicted in your analyses, which are the confirmatory analyses, from your exploratory analyses. But you can explore as much as you want. So pre-registration does not curtail creativity. And another pushback that you get is that with the replication work is that people will say, well, we're being unfairly targeted. The social psychologists say this a lot. And to some extent, I understand this because, as I said earlier, their experiments are easier to replicate. You don't need a lot of technology. You don't have a complex design. Relatively easy to do. So that makes them an easy target. On the other hand, I find some of their responses to be rather offensive. So they will say that people who perform replications are self-appointed sheriffs, or the replication mafia, and those sorts of terms are associated with people doing replication research as if we're some sort of a
scientific lynch mob or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas, at least in the projects that I participate in, I expect there to be an effect. I'm optimistic that we'll find an effect. And if we don't, I'm disappointed. I will never participate in a project because I think I won't find anything. So I go in at least with the expectation that we'll find something. But my expectation doesn't matter because we pre-register the study. And in some of these cases, we collaborate with 10 to 20 other labs. Then we look at the effect across all the labs. We perform a meta-analysis across all the labs. And then often we find that, no, there's not so much difference between labs. They all show pretty much the same effect. But overall, there's no support for the hypothesis. The original study found a pretty big effect, but overall, there's no effect. And that's happened a couple of times. But it was not because the researchers set out to disprove this one hypothesis. Most of the researchers involved in the project thought it was an interesting hypothesis and were disappointed when the effect didn't support the hypothesis.
You could see where psychologically nobody's going to want to be in the situation where something that they were credited with discovering turns out to be a non-discovery. That's going to be just naturally disappointing. But on the other hand, despite the hurt feelings, it's in the public interest, in the scientific interest for everybody to be operating on real information.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly the point. You want to be operating on real information, and you don't want to send people up a blind alley. If we now find nobody else can get this finding, then at least it tells other researchers, don't try this at home because, if you expect to get a significant finding, forget it. On the other hand, it's also the case that if a group of labs comes together to investigate a certain finding, it also is actually a compliment for the original author. Apparently, this finding is interesting enough for a lot of people to start replicating it. So I see it as nothing negative. So this pushback against pre-registration and replication, while understandable in some cases, is not very constructive and is often very personal. It doesn't come with a lot of scientific argumentation.
You know what it reminds me of is cop movies, where you always sort of have this push and pull between cops on the police force and internal affairs. You know, their job is to investigate cops. But I think everybody sort of recognizes if you don't have internal affairs, you get corrupt police departments. It's like they're an adversarial role, but they need to be there. There's a good structural reason why it exists.
That's true. And here it's even the case that every researcher who also performs replications can be the topic of a replication study. So we're all peers. The people who perform the replication studies are doing this in addition to their normal work. It's not that they're full-time replicators.
Right.
Although I do have a little bit of a concern that now with this replication movement, some people are thinking, well, I'm just going to be a meta-psychologist. I'm going to investigate other psychologists. I wonder if that's a good career move, because in the long run, if you're not a methodologist, let's say you're a social psychologist who now starts investigating other social psychologists, after a while people may ask, so what did you actually contribute to theories about social psychology? And then, you'd have to say, well, I showed that a lot of findings don't replicate. And I wonder if it's good for early career researchers to launch into this. I'm kind of ambivalent about it. On the one hand, I think it's extremely useful that people do it. On the other hand, we can't all be internal affairs cops. We also have to catch criminals. And we can't all be referees. We also have to pass the ball. So I worry a little bit that this replication movement will lead to a huge number of meta-psychologists. And I don't know if that's really that useful.
It's interesting to think about the social dynamics that would form there if experiment replicators become sort of a caste unto themselves within science. It seems like it's kind of better to have the Hobbesian war of all against all, where everybody at some point in their career is kind of looking for holes in other people's findings, but also trying to do their own original research. So you don't get so entrenched in just trying to get the trophies of other people's theories on your wall or your mantelpiece. That's what your career becomes about.
That's right. I agree completely. We should all be both player and referee, and police ourselves, so to say. I think if we do it that way, then also we prevent the emergence of bubbles, where you have your meta-psychology bubble. And the meta-psychology people all talk to each other, but they don't have impact on the rest of the field. So I think it's much better if we just say, okay, replication is just a role we play, but we have to do it as part of our scientific work, but it's not our only scientific contribution. Because, you could also think about a promotion and tenure committee, and would that committee really be impressed with somebody who just has a series of replications of other people's work? I don't think so, because they would say, well, you haven't really made a creative contribution. Now, if you're a methodologist doing replications and then drawing some general methodological conclusions out of all your analyses, that's extremely useful, of course. But for the regular developmental, cognitive, or social psychologist, I just think this is something that you should do replication as part of your normal work. We should also not antagonize people too much. So that means that we should stay in discussion with the other side, even though they are a little bit aggressive at times. They can be denigrating. We should still convince them with arguments rather than basically try to non-replicate the hell out of them.
Stepping sort of out of the scientific sphere for a moment, when somebody in the general public reads about failures of replication, sometimes you'll hear people say, oh, all that science stuff can't be replicated. They're just making it up. I might as well believe whatever it is I feel like believing. What's the best retort to that?
Yeah, that's a very good issue to address. And actually, we have been addressing it in a recent paper. We've looked at findings that are extremely replicable. So there are findings in psychology that are hard to replicate, but others are extremely easy to replicate. So we've recently written a paper in which we took 9 findings from cognitive psychology involving attention and memory and language. And we thought these experiments are extremely replicable. We took them from the lab to an online environment and ran them, and we got pretty much the same findings as in the original experiment. So we could generalize from the lab to an online environment, which consists of people maybe sitting in a library doing the experiment and getting paid, or people holding a baby while doing the experiment, people watching TV with half an eye doing the experiment, and still we got the results. Not only that, but we tested these same people 3 days later in the same experiment. And you might think, well, if somebody has participated in an experiment, they're going to know what the experiment was about, so they're going to behave differently the second time around. But the second time around, we found pretty much exactly the same effects. So the fact that people had already participated, had seen this experiment, did not matter at all for these experiments. And we think this is because the experiments involve pretty automatic processes that people don't have any cognitive control over. And so these are very robust findings. And I think that points the way to an approach in psychology where we could just say, rather than taking findings that are a little bit difficult to replicate or that don't replicate, let's take ones that we know are very robust and then test the robustness of them by making it harder and harder for ourselves to find the effect. And so I think we need to go more in that direction where we just take the strongest findings and build our science around them rather than try to investigate findings where we might have a hope that they replicate, but we're not quite sure. Because that gets us then into discussions that I think are often a little bit fruitless, where people will say, okay, well, of course you didn't replicate me. I ran my experiment in Illinois and you're in Iowa. And then you think, well, if your experiment doesn't even generalize beyond Illinois, then why would we care about it? Why did you even run the experiment? And what happens is that people say this after the fact when it doesn't replicate. That's another problem. If you can say beforehand, well, don't expect this finding to extend beyond this or that boundary, then that seems fine. So I guess people know about the Stroop effect.
Yeah. This is the color change thing. Quick recap for people. The Stroop effect is that if you see a word written in a color other than what the word is, like if you see the word red, but the word is in a blue font, it takes you longer to process it one way or the other.
Yeah, exactly. Because you want to read the word, it almost goes automatically, but that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to name the color of the ink, and that makes it harder. This was a study first done by J.R. Stroop in 1935. This replicates all over the place, but you wouldn't expect it to replicate with blind people or with people who don't speak English. So there are limitations to this effect, which are pretty obvious, but you might think, well, maybe it replicates with Dutch speakers of English. Sure, they're not native speakers, but they're proficient enough that they can recognize the word red very quickly, which is actually a disadvantage in the Stroop task. And sure, they will show the effect. I even remember doing this when my daughter was little. She was 4. My parents were visiting. I was living in the States at the time. And I gave them the Stroop task. And I told my parents, or asked them, who do you think will do better? And they thought that they would do better. But of course, they were much slower on the incongruent items where the word is in red and the word green is written. And my daughter was much better. But that was, of course, because she couldn't read yet. So she could name the colors without being affected by the meaning of the word. So, but this Stroop effect, it won't replicate all the time. There are boundaries to the effect, but you can fairly clearly state them. So there are researchers now who say what every researcher should do is in their paper, they should specify the limitations of the generalizability of the effect. So if then I write a paper and I say, I don't expect this effect to extend beyond the borders of Iowa, but it has strong implications for business and education and medicine, then people will say, no, that's not possible. How can it be one and the other? Can't be both. And so that people will be more modest in their claims and will also be forced to think more about what does my effect really mean. So I think that's also a really good development in the field.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost like there's sort of an imaginary axis between a universal law on one hand and an anecdote on the other. And, you set your dial, like how strong is this on the anecdote side versus the universal law side?
Exactly. And when your finding is strong on the anecdote side, maybe you don't even need an experiment. Maybe you can just write an essay or something like that. Or sometimes people have very interesting ideas, but it's really difficult to come up with a solid experiment to test them. But the ideas might still be worthwhile, so why go through all the trouble to do an experiment that you then have to say doesn't generalize? You could just do without the experiment. I think that would be okay in a lot of cases. It would have a different weight, scientific weight, of course, than a solid empirical finding, but it might still be informative. And you're absolutely right that if we continue this way, or the way we had been going, then we run the risk of being in a situation where more people would say, okay, well, who cares about science? And we might as well believe whatever is in the National Enquirer. I'm not saying that every American thinks this, but there are quite a few people in America and also in the Netherlands who seem to think that science is really not much better than whatever your neighbor has to tell you about climate change or something else.
Is there a fundamental difference? Like, is this much less of a problem in sciences directly relating to things like engineering and stuff? I mean, I can't help but think, well, my iPhone works. works. It's like if the data was wrong
exactly.
in electrical engineering, it's like I'd know about it because my iPhone wouldn't work.
Yeah, that's right. I always use the example of bridges. You wouldn't be able to build bridges if 2/3 of them collapse within a year. And so, yeah, when you have to produce a product that needs to work, then the rules of the game are very different, I think. That's not to say that it's not hard to do social science. It's extremely hard, but the test is still some statistical test. Usually it's not a device that's really being put to the test in the real world and that may fall apart if it's not designed properly. Of course, it does still happen, that buildings collapse because of design flaws. And so these things do happen, but not to the extent that we have non-replications in psychology.
Smart Drug Smarts.
So thank you so very much to Dr. Rolf Zwaan for taking the time for that conversation. We actually had that talk just a couple of days ago. I was thinking that was going to be something I would publish much later in the summer, but I thought that was such an interesting one and just so timely that I wanted to publish it while it was still fresh. It kind of got under my skin, and it's the kind of thing that has broader ramifications. It's not just one finding. It's a conversation about how science is to be performed in the future going forward. And it seems really in everybody's best interest that we get this right. I'm obviously a science advocate, and that's not just science versus superstition or science versus irrationality, but it's also the finer grain detailed of how science is best performed. And we use the term scientific process, and science really is a process, a methodology. And like any process, it can be graded not just on does it produce a correct result, but how quickly and efficiently does it produce that correct result. So I don't think if we get the answer to the replication crisis wrong, that it leads to a failure of science to ever produce anything useful. It just means that it might just not produce useful things as fast as it might otherwise, which basically means it takes the future longer to get here. People who are really into the ideas that we talked about here and want to pursue it with missionary zeal, you should know about the Center for Open Science if you don't already. That's at cos.io on the web. They are a nonprofit organization fighting the good fight. But as for us, let's move along now to the ruthless listener retention gimmick.
Smart Drug Smarts. Ruthless listener retention gimmick.
So it doesn't take a heck of a lot of research to know that nobody likes a gloating winner. Hooting and hollering to rub things in when you've just achieved a victory is probably no way to endear yourself to anybody. But recent research conducted at the USC Institute for Creative Technologies and sponsored by the U.S. Army Research Laboratory has actually found that not only does gloating make people angry, it actually makes you less likely to win in the future, at least depending on the game scenario in question. In this exact study, 370 participants played a version of the British television game show called Golden Balls. If you're not familiar with that game, participants decide to either split a pot of money with the other player or to steal it from them. If both participants choose split, they both get an equal share. If one player chooses to split with the other one stealing, the thief gets the whole thing. And if both people try to steal, neither one gets anything. Participants played with one another over video Skype so they could see the other player and they could also have the video recorded and later analyzed by researchers. The people's facial clues as they played were encoded using emotion tracking software that captures muscle movements, including everything from cheek motions to lip and chin raises, dimple formation, and the compression and separation of the lips. So a lot of points of data there, in addition to people being more willing to basically make self-destructive moves within the game in order to punish someone who has beat them and then gloated about it. There was also a statistical correlation between people that smiled when they were defeated and then being victorious in the future. So the researchers hypothesized that smiling successful cheaters open themselves up to future payback, whereas smiling during a loss apparently endears people and gestures towards future cooperation and mutual success. Obviously, the exact outcomes here are going to be game dependent, but statistical proof that people do not like gloating victors. One of the study's directors is Dr. Jonathan Gratch, who is director of virtual humans research at the USC Institute for Creative Technologies. Talking about the usefulness of this study of emotion, he says, "We think that emotion is the enemy of reason, but the truth is that emotion is our way of assigning value to things. Without it, we'd be faced with limitless choices." And Gratch's work includes close collaboration with the USC Marshall School of Business over the last several years to try to incorporate virtual humans into negotiation scenarios who can actually understand the emotional tells of human negotiators.
We like to think of ourselves as a digital speakeasy for brain hackers, but you can call us Smart Drug Smarts.
Okay, so that's it for episode number 186. Thank you for hanging around until the very end. If you enjoyed this episode, you will find everything that we talked about here up online at smartdrugsmarts.com/186. On the shiny new, recently revamped smartdrugsmarts.com website, Last week in episode number 185, I spoke with Dr. Rachel Seidler about the brains of astronauts and how we can best protect them as they explore space and if there might be any follow-on benefits for those of us remaining on Earth. And next week in episode number 187, it's going to be Workaholics Day, a lesser-known holiday, but one that has made its way onto the calendar. I'm not sure if we'll do anything special for the Workaholics Day episode, but we might. But I'm going to keep you guessing. You'll have to check back next Friday. Same time, same podcast, and with that same unwavering commitment to helping you fine-tune the performance of your own brain. Have a great first week of summer, and stay smart.
You've been listening to the Smart Drug Smarts podcast. Visit us online at www.smartdrugsmarts.com and subscribe to our mailing list to keep your neurons buzzing with the latest in brain optimization. Smart Drug Smarts should be listened to for entertainment purposes only, although some guests on the show are medical doctors, most are not, and the host is just some random guy. Nothing you hear on this podcast or read at smartdrugsmarts.com should be considered medical advice. Consult your doctor and use some damn common sense before doing anything you think might have a lasting impact on your brain.